Well, hi everyone, and welcome to this second edition of the new webinar, Corruption of Scripts. I'm your host, Joseph Pochga Alvarez, and I'm very excited to have been able to get this brilliant group of scholars together to discuss the topic of anti-corruption in illiberal settings. Before I move on to briefly introduce the panelists for today, I would just like to remind everyone that this meeting is being recorded and it will be uploaded to YouTube and shared via social media in about a month's time. Yes. Um, if this is not the first time that you join us, you pretty much understand how the format is, except that this time it is truly a roundtable rather than just being a project presentation. We'll be dividing the session between two rounds of participation, and then we'll open up the floor for a bit of a conversation. Yes? During the first round, each one of the panelists will have about 10 minutes to address some of the questions that I have, and then we'll do something like that for a second round, but a little bit shorter. And as I said, after that, we'll very much open the floor. So the reason for this specific topic, as many of you will have realized, uh, there is a tradition in the anti-corruption literature of relating the control of corruption to the strengthening of democratic institutions, or certainly looking at the democratic environment as providing the basic for effective anti-corruption. Yes. Now, traditionally, this has meant that it has fallen on the sideway, this idea of anti-corruption being properly addressed in illiberal settings, and there's a reason for that. Yes, but rather than just being immediately skeptical about it or just dismissing of it, I thought it would be interesting to dive deeper into this topic. And it was just very coincidental and fortuitous that very recently, Marina and her colleagues, and Manuel and Luciano, Hera and others who are present here today, they published a number of papers as part of a special issue for the journal Sociology of Development. The special issue was called Anti-Corruption and Illiberal Turns in National Politics in the Global South. So I would like to invite Marina Zaloznaya, which, Marina, I would like for you to say a little bit about yourself while you also address this question. As you were editor of this special issue, uh, in the introduction to the special issue, you also talk about the misuse and unintended consequences of anti-corruption reforms, and specifically how these abuses take form or take place through two specific key mechanisms that you talk about there. Uh, could you perhaps describe and tell us about this intersection between anti-corruption efforts and illiberal politics? Yes, and how these situations come to be in the cases that the special issue covered.
Sure. Thank you so much, Joseph. And it is wonderful to see everybody. Thank you so much for being here. It's only 7 a.m. here in Arizona, so hopefully it's a little later wherever you are. I am an associate professor of sociology and political science. I'm currently based at Arizona State University, and my work is on corruption and anti-corruption, sort of the political dimensions of both. So, to introduce the topic briefly, I want to build on what Joseph has already said. Basically, over the last 30 years, we've seen an entire large industry of so-called anti-corruptionism grow around the world, with billions of dollars being invested in attempts coordinated by a set of institutions on the transnational level, such as various conventions and bilateral and multilateral agreements, to fight corruption, various funding mechanisms, and expert and scholarly communities dedicated to the idea that we as an international community can eradicate corruption, can help places in the global south specifically to do so. And the major justification for that, supported very much by research, is that corruption and democracy are incompatible, right? So the idea is that, yes, this is a very much an economic endeavor and in many ways started because sort of Western elites wanted to make sure that their investments in new emerging markets were safe. But ultimately, liberalizing markets goes hand in hand with liberalizing politics, right? So that the reason why we spend so much money and effort on this is because abuse of office for private gain is ultimately incompatible to people's right for self-determination. And again, I said that it's supported by research because, the indicators put out there by Transparency International and similar organizations, in econometric analysis and in basically regression studies so the indicators of corruption tend to correlate with indicators of illiberalism, political illiberalism. Um, at the same time, over the same period that we've invested billions of dollars and put a great effort into this enterprise, we've noticed the consistent democratic backsliding around the world. So according to multiple indices of political health, we are currently in the sort of 17th or 18th consecutive year of democratic backsliding, meaning that there are more countries where democracy lost strength relative to countries where democracy has gained strength around the world. And obviously, democratic backsliding is an extremely complicated process. There's a lot that goes into this. But, I started this project thinking about the optics of it, right? How is it that democratic backsliding has been happening at the same time as this major global project to fight corruption? And there is quite a bit of work out there on the topic, connecting the two, basically arguing that a lot of the times anti-corruptionism, in fact, despite the good intentions, can contribute to the weakening of civil liberties and political rights within individual countries. Of course, some people see it as sort of just an outcome of insufficient or unsuccessful reforms, right? So if only we fought corruption better, this would have been prevented. But a lot of scholars know that anti-corruption efforts themselves oftentimes carry with them the grain of illiberalism. The two major mechanisms whereby it happens, according to the literature, are subversion and backlash. So subversion is something that we may have observed in China and Russia, so in kind of hegemonic autocracies where, democratic backsliding as the term does not apply to them because they were not democratic to begin with, but whatever political rights and civil liberties their citizens had might have been weakened due to the anti-corruption efforts of the national government. And it's because ultimately it is subverted. The idea of anti-corruption reforms in their basic form is hollowed out and used by a non-democratic leader in power to pursue their own political agenda, right? So we know, for instance, that post 2012 rise of Alexei Navalny in Russia as an opposition leader, Russian government has engaged in a concerted effort of using corruption accusations against their political opponents, essentially jailing the folks who are either threatening to the regime on manufactured corruption charges or who have more broad Western orientation that is sort of essentially used as a signaling to other elites in an effort to manage them that, you need to be looking inward, not towards the West. Similar accusations or arguments have been made about anti-corruptionism under the President Xi in China since 2013. This is pretty straightforward way whereby anti-corruption can be used for nefarious purposes of promoting illiberal governance, of course. A more complicated and interesting, I think, sort of analytically interesting way whereby this can happen is backlash. And this is something that we see in less consolidated autocratic settings, in settings where there's more political freedom. But basically, following a wave of really high-level corruption scandals in several countries around the world, we've seen a new type of political leader come to power, and think Bolsonaro, think Duterte in the Philippines, sorry, Bolsonaro in Brazil, obviously, Duterte in the Philippines, Orban in Hungary. Basically, a strongman populist leader arguing that we need to quote unquote drain the swamp or get rid of the clear out the corrupt establishment, and so they rise on the popular tide of support for this kind of leadership, only to pursue illiberal politics once in power. So basically using the distrust or popular distrust of institutions associated with experiences of corruption by ordinary citizens to essentially further diminish the power of these institutions and discredit them and govern in the anti-establishment way that ultimately further undermines popular trust and weakens democracy. I mean, obviously, we've seen the variations of this processes across global south, but also across global north. So consolidated democracies that we haven't expected to undergo similar processes, in a variety of Western European contexts and U.S. contexts. We've seen political leaders follow the same kind of backlash way of using anti-corruptionism to diminish democratic strength. Now, there's nothing wrong with these two mechanisms, right? They do exist, and they've been identified widely, and there is little debate about them. I guess the idea for this special issue was based on the premise that they just don't tell the whole story, right? They don't tell this whole story because I argue anti-corruptionism is really conceived in scholarship that promotes these two mechanisms in overly simplistic ways. So first of all, both of the mechanisms kind of suggest some sort of coordinated effort by political leaders, a master plan, right? A conscious desire to manipulate social processes to their own gain. And while, sure, this desire might be there, we know that social life is a lot more complex than that, that there is a lot that can happen because of historical contingency, right? So historical processes that occur at the same time, creating political opportunities for this kind of political action to occur. So I think the interesting question is not whether or not backlash happened or whether or not essentially the autocratic leader was able to manipulate anti-corruption reforms, but more why were they able to do it and under what conditions, under what socio-historical premises was this kind of political action possible, right? So stepping away from just ending the explanation with saying, oh, there is this bad person or coalition of people who wanted to take advantage of these reforms, and instead trying to understand under what structural conditions is this possible, is this not possible. The second critique that I levy of these explanations is that anti-corruptionism is always contested among multiple actors. So we know that sort of the international global regime and transnational legal order of anti-corruptionism issues its prescriptions. But we've seen these prescriptions play out in a variety of different ways in local contexts. And I argue this is because there is multiple political actors who are involved. Besides the international actors and national leadership, there is also oftentimes very strong civil societies that are involved in contesting and wanting to own their own version of anti-corruptionism, right? There is also oppositional politicians that try to participate in this. Owning anti-corruptionism now is associated with access to a lot of resources, right? So the international community will support you with grants. The ordinary citizens will support whoever they believe is honestly trying to fight corruption because it's such strong mobilization potential among the population, right? So there is lots and lots and lots that's happening, and we need to look at this domestic contestation of these reforms to really understand how they play out. And then the final critique that I will levy is that, I think we are caught as scholarly community and the policy community in this sort of thinking about corruption, anti-corruption, black and white terms, right? So what Marco Garrido calls anti-corruption fundamentalism, right? We just believe that corruption is bad, anti-corruption is good. And sure, most of the time it is, but there's just so much more to that because corruption is a violation of formal rules a lot of the times, and it's only bad when the formal rules are good, right? And that is not always the case. So we need to analyze the context. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that we need to move out of this binaries that anti-corruptionism is always good, corruption is always bad. And accepting these two mechanisms as the only way to think about the connection between illiberalism, political liberalism, and anti-corruptionism keeps us within that boundary, right? We're still thinking in these two terms. So now we're thinking, okay, well, anti-corruption is not good, and now anti-corruption is bad. No, there is a lot more. Both of the processes are corruption and anti-corruption are socially constructed and contingent on cultural understandings, on political context, on historical context. And as scholars, we should move beyond this unhelpful dyadic thinking towards more analyzing what is actually happening on the ground with all of the different actors involved to really understand the link between illiberalism and anti-corruptionism. And I think this special issue moves us forward with that because we do have some examples of backlash and subversion that are analyzed in the issue with a lot more complex and nuanced view. And you'll see Luciano and Manoel will talk about an example of backlash, I think, analyzed from in that manner. The chapter on Russia, the article on Russia talks about subversion, but in ways that accommodates historical contingency. But we'll also introduce some other ways. Yes. So I will stop now, but yes. Thank you. Look forward to hearing others.
Perfect. I think that provides us with the structure to then jump directly into the specific cases. So of course that point that you were making, and it really resonates with me about this idea of using anti-corruption to consolidate power and then move the needle towards illiberal politics. And I remember something, for example, that Nathan Hogg, he's here as well, he writes in the case of Italy in a comparative perspective. Now, I would like to turn to Manoel Gehrke now. So, Manuel, you wrote one of the papers, specifically looking at the case of El Salvador with Luciano. So, El Salvador, of course, is a very interesting case, right? Bukele, for example, you explain or you argue that is ironically that is the increase of anti-corruption support that emerges in the country that eventually provide a condition for the erosion of democratic and accountability institution that we're seeing today. And of course, Bukele continues to be, as far as I understand, extremely popular in the country, right? So could you walk us through in terms of how this happened?
Sure. Hello, everyone. So yeah, it's great to be part of this roundtable. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us and to Joseph for organizing this. So I think, yeah, to answer your question, right, as Marina was saying, like we really wanted to dig deeper into what happened, right? So a lot has been said about Bukele, right? His fast rise to power, and a lot has been explored in terms of his ability to bring down crime rates and how this was effective, right? But we think that the anti-corruption played an important role, right, in explaining his rise to power. So I will go a little bit back to like El Salvador's political history. This will be short, right? But since El Salvador is a much smaller country, and I guess people are not super familiar with its history, right? So El Salvador democratized in the 1990s only, right? And justice was one of the sectors that the peace negotiations paid close attention to, right? So the intent to reform justice, right, during this period, right? And for most of the period after democratization until 2009, El Salvador was governed by a traditional conservative party, the Arena, right? And but in 2009, and there were some reforms to the judiciary, but in 2009 there is a successful and claim to and like to a really important case of successful transfer of power to a leftist party that was part of the guerrilla during the Civil War, right? So this guerrilla coalition, the FMLN, right, rose to power in 2009, right? And this is a reformist party, right? So they go they go on with the judicial reforms that were taking place in El Salvador since democratization, but they also include a lot more in terms of reforms to increase transparency in the country, to increase to improve the capacity to recover illicit assets, right? And to also like oversee corruption inside the public sector, right? So during this whole period, right, El Salvador is a quite more similar to a bipartisan system than most other Latin American countries, right? So you have this transfer of power in between the two largest parties in the country, right? And together they controlled something like 75% of the seats in the National Assembly throughout this period of democratization until very recently, right? So they also, because Supreme Court justices and the Prosecutor General in El Salvador are appointed by 2/3 of the National Assembly, right? So it doesn't depend on the president, but depends on the directly on the National Assembly this nomination, and of course, Prosecutor General plays an important role in terms of overseeing elite corruption. Right. And it's only in 2016 when we see the appointment of Prosecutor General Melendez that we see this massive anti-corruption surge, which happened not coincidentally, right? Also happened in many other neighboring countries in South America, in Central America, but also in South America, right? This is a period of the car wash operation that is having different effects across Latin America, right? And involves, so prior to the car wash, there were already presidents who governed from the arena, from the right-wing party, there were some corruption scandals that did not go forward. The cases did not go forward very quickly, right? But there is this big drive after this specific prosecutor general is appointed in 2016, right? And we see very fast, right? So these different revelations, and things go, and we see already in 2016, 3 former presidents are being prosecuted on corruption cases, right? And one of them is already convicted in that year, right? So things start moving quite quickly, right? And we have also not only the former presidents, but also important legislators who get involved. We have a former prosecutor, the predecessor to Melendez, the former prosecutor general of El Salvador gets prosecuted as well for corruption, right? So we have a lot of anti-corruption activity during this period, right? And as a consequence, see, right, this massive delegitimization of democratic institutions in El Salvador, right? So even the institutions leading the prosecution, right, the prosecutor's office, the judiciary that is being much more active in terms of making decisions that allow these high-level politicians to be prosecuted, they are not able to gain, right? So people are skeptical of everyone, right, and includes the people leading the anti-corruption process itself, right? So there is this massive public sentiment changes, right? That also affects for example, how people answer to surveys, in how much they value democracy, right? So there is this shift towards more tolerance towards authoritarianism in El Salvador, right? Even before the presidential elections in 2019, that you might know, when it's the time when Nayib Bukele, this authoritarian populist, gets elected to office, right, and starts reversing, right, and then we observe in the paper, Luciano and I observe this anti-corruption being reversed, right, and but also used like there is some accommodation, right, with Bukele's allies, but also some intensification with some of Bukele's enemies, right? And then in 2021, when Bukele's party, Nuevas Ideas, New Ideas, gets the two-thirds majority in the Legislative Assembly, on the same day they had their first meeting, they decide to remove both the acting prosecutor general, and the Constitutional Court justices in the country, right, and replace them with allied prosecutor general and justices, right? So this is a big and important power grab, and this has only so far has only continued, right? So they also the same Legislative Assembly has announced emergency status, right? So giving the president, the government, a much more leeway in terms of arresting people and different aspects. So just to summarize, right? So we observed this like massive anti-corruption surge, this party system collapse, right? So we had these two main parties, right? Both suffer a lot, right? Both from the left and the right in El Salvador, to be massively involved in all these corruption scandals. This reversal in terms of public sentiment, and on the elite side, right? We have these elites, in order to protect the president Bukele from being his administration from being investigated, right? They're also reversing the same oversight institutions that made the anti-corruption surge possible, right? And also, for example, they issued legislation forbidding the investigation on procurement and contracts made during the COVID-19 pandemic, right? Some things that could be damaging for the government's legitimacy, right? But as Joseph rightly pointed out in his question, right, we also see like Bukele has remained quite popular, right, and was reelected a couple of years ago, right, and has governed with quite of popular support as well. But it's also one of the fastest autocratization processes that we have observed in the world in this century, right? So I don't know if that answers your question, Joseph.
Oh, very, very much so. Thank you. I'll definitely come back during the second round to ask you about the role of external actors. But before doing that, I would like to then travel a little south, yes, because of course Luciano as well addresses the case of Brazil. Now, for what I understand, and based on the paper, the Brazilian case follows or contains a lot of the same elements that we find in the case of El Salvador. Brazil has had a very interesting evolution in its politics, right? After having been governed by a leftist party for 13 years, we see then a course correction towards the right with Jair Bolsonaro from 2019 to 2023. Of course, coming on the wake of the massive scandal related to the Lava Jato. was felt within Brazil, but it also had, as Manuel mentioned, like very strong consequences and impacts in other countries in Latin America. I'm from Peru, and you know as well, it pretty much meant that a number of leaders of political parties and presidents involved in the case also ended up facing prison time. Uh, but now, of course, Bolsonaro is faced prosecution, and it seems that the institutions for the administration of justice seem to have jumped or bounced back, right? So we see that even though it shared a number of elements with the case of El Salvador, the path at the end diverted from it. Could you tell us a little bit about this, how the Brazilian case departs in detail from the El Salvador one, and how do you see that meaning for anti-corruption and the resilience of democratic institutions?
Sure. So thanks. Hi, everyone. So thanks for having us, Joseph. It's a great opportunity to present publicly the findings of this project, which I should thank Marina for making it happen, for leading us, including us. So thanks also Manuel and Hera and others who are not here, unfortunately, for being a part of this journey. So thanks, everyone. About the question, let me just start saying something very quickly. So even though Manuel and I both wrote both of these articles together on Brazil and El Salvador, these cases are not, of course, in any way a controlled comparison, right? So actually, they've been selected their objects of study because they illustrate different trajectories departing from the same starting point, so to speak, right? So both countries experienced, of course, different but somewhat similar intense anti-corruption drives, and have exhibited some similar results, including this massive delegitimization of political elites that Manuel was talking about in the case of El Salvador, which also happened in Brazil. But of course, there are differences, of course, as you said, Joseph, right? So the autocratization process was much more intense in El Salvador than in Brazil. Brazil, in many ways, democratic institutions bounced back. Of course, you can talk how well they are right now, but of course, they're much better than in El Salvador. So that said, right, if we're to compare both cases, right, which are not comparable, as I just said, our idea is more to generate hypotheses. So everything I say here is very tentative, right? So it's just the conclusions derived from this somewhat comparison are very tentative. And again, while there are some similarities in the countries, they're both third wave presidential Latin American democracies, right, if you will, right? There are various differences, and many of these differences help explaining why illiberalism went much further and still going much further in El Salvador than in Brazil. So you can start with the more institutional political science variables, right? Brazil is a multi-party democracy, right? Whereas El Salvador, as Manuel said, was for the most part bipartisan. Brazil is a federation, whereas El Salvador is a unitary state. Brazil, which is somewhat important, has a tradition of a relatively robust, stable, professionalized civil service, both at the federal and state levels. And of course, Brazil is much larger, more populous, much more diverse regionally, which in many ways, all these different characteristics make Brazil much more complex economically, socially, right, politically, making collective action and hence policy change much more difficult in Brazil than in El Salvador. So if I were to summarize, right, in political science jargon, so to speak, I would summarize in this way. So political change in any direction you will, right, either towards more democracy or towards less democracy, is harder in Brazil than it is in a country such as El Salvador, right? And of course, in many ways, the interplay among these various variables that I'm describing made at least Bolsonaro's ability to hold and concentrate power much harder than it made than the different characteristics made for Bukele to concentrate power, right? So a key element was essentially what Manuel was saying, right? Given Brazil's long-standing, multi-party, hyper-fragmented, actually, multi-party system, and federalism, which plays a strong hand, so to speak, in contributing to the fragmentation. Bolsonaro was never able to capture the entirety or even 2/3, right, of the legislature. Actually, not even close to that. So Brazil kept, and still is, for the most part, a very fragmented political system. So if you recall from Manuel's presentation a few minutes ago, in many ways what was key to Bukele was to capture the legislature, to then capture the rest, so to speak. Bolsonaro never did that, never achieved something remotely close to that. So that's why, right, most of these measures, court curbing measures, court packing measures, emergency powers, these things never happened in Brazil, right? But they did in El Salvador, right? So in many ways, Bolsonaro was never able to weaponize the anti-corruption apparatus against opponents as Bukele came to be able to do so, right? So there's never a subversion, to go back to the mechanisms Marina was describing. There's never a subversion, so to speak, or at least in a grand scale in Brazil as it came to happen in El Salvador, right? So for the most part, the efforts, Brazil is a very clear case of backlash. That's why it's in the title of the article in many ways, okay? And in many ways, what happened in Brazil is this joint effort, so to speak, of a populist president on the one hand, and the backlash against the anti-corruption drive for most political elite, right? So because Bolsonaro was never able to weaponize these institutions, actually the main driving force behind court curbing and other mechanisms that we often associate to illiberalism, actually the driving force behind these things, behind these processes, were essentially what we called an impunity coalition, so to speak, which comprised not only Bolsonaro's forces and supporters, but also various independent sectors in Congress, and even the leftist opposition of the Bolsonaro presidency. So most of these, if you look at some roll call votes in Congress, actually, you see that it's pretty much consensual among the political elites to put brakes on various anti-corruption efforts, including, of course, the massive car wash Lava Jato investigation, but also other things, right? Other laws, right? There were, in many ways, they're up for grabs within the realm of this impunity coalition that were reformed, right? A new law, an example, right, of this is the abuse of authority law, which criminalized more than 30 types of behavior of prosecutors, investigators, and judges, which was enacted with the support of essentially everyone in Congress, right? There's another, which is the administrative improbity law, which had been the most important actually tool to fight corruption from the perspective of the prosecutors for the last, I don't know, 25, 30 years in Brazil, which was really severely gutted, so to speak. Okay, so already with impact. Okay, so the number of cases filed dropped by more than 50%. The number of convictions based on this law dropped by more than 80%, right? And this was a bill that was proposed by the Workers' Party, Lula's party, right? But which was enacted during Bolsonaro's presidency. This shows a bit how this the main goal of Brazil's political elite in the wake of Lava Jato was to neutralize anti-corruption efforts, right? To put a lid, so to speak, right, on the anti-corruption efforts, much more than eventually subverting this mechanism, these anti-corruption mechanisms, and using them to concentrate power. So in many ways, Bolsonaro aligned with this general goal and used that to some extent to try to concentrate power, but this is actually the driving force behind most of the backlash is what, as I said previously, this anti-corruption or impunity coalition, so to speak. That's why Bolsonaro was never able actually to instrumentalize and weaponize the anti-corruption apparatus to really concentrate powers and try to rely on other factors to do so. Maybe I answered your question,
Yes.
but I'm happy to talk more about it if you really, because the Brazilian case is really huge. But of course,
Yes, I was just going to say, I feel like we could keep talking for an hour about each one of these cases because they are so rich in detail and as you said, even though they share some elements, of course, the crux of the issue is how the actors actually get together, start connecting to devise these strategies to consolidate power and repurpose the anti-corruption apparatus, of course. Um, so I would like to now move on to the case of India. Hera Shakil wrote a paper for the special issue on both the trajectory of anti-corruption or corruption scandals and anti-corruption reactions in India, and now more recently looking at the administration of Prime Minister Modi. Now, India produces or presents a very interesting case, right? Because nowadays, of course, whenever political scientists and other social scientists speak or they call the case of India, uh, more often than not, the issue is about the consolidation of power by Hindu nationalist actors, right? Um, Now, India, of course, is Brazil is a large state as well, but India is the biggest democracy in the world, and more importantly, outside of a very brief period in the middle of the 1970s, it has consistently preserved that nature of its institutions since independence, despite the challenges, right, that India has faced, including high levels of corruption in the country. So I would love to ask you here about how you understand this relationship between democracy, specifically consistent democracy, which again in Latin America that's extremely rare, right? For the entirety of its Republican period, on the one hand and corruption on the other. And now looking at the current administration, if you feel that or you believe the descendant of Prime Minister Modi and his party represent really a departure from the past, and if so, in which ways?
Yeah, thank you so much, Joseph, for inviting us, and it's very nice to see everyone again from the Special Issue Project. Thank you, Marina, for including us and for your fearless leadership. I think a lot of, as Marina was describing, like the larger project, I realized a lot of the things that made sense for me about the Indian case was under this kind of guidance. So thank you so much again. Yeah, it is kind of depressing that this is the largest continuous democracy in the country, and this is what is happening to it. But in terms of thinking about your first question about the relationship between corruption and democracy in India, this is sort of one of the things that was my aim for the paper, was to sort of think about how things have changed in terms of talking about corruption in the larger public sphere and in the social culture of India. And this is the thing that I tried to trace both in this project, and in other projects that I'm working on. So it's sort of, I argue that it's been fairly banal up till the late 1980s. Yeah, there was widespread corruption and rent seeking in sort of public infrastructure and contracts and things like that, but it was not really making or breaking political careers and making or breaking elections in a way that we start seeing in the late 1980s when a big sort of defense contract scam comes to light called the Bofors scam, which involves a Swedish defense company, and there's huge evidence of huge amounts of kickbacks taken by high-level Indian politicians, and it breaks in around 1987 when Rajiv Gandhi is the prime minister, and he's himself implicated in the scam or scandal. This kept coming up when we were working on this project, that we call these things it's scams in India, but they're largely called scandals in the rest of the world. And this sort of breaks his his government, and also his bid to become prime minister again in 1989, and brings forward a coalition government. And more importantly, throughout the 90s and throughout the 2000s, Rajiv Gandhi's party, which is the Congress party, which had been in power fairly on and off and was the major political party of India until 2014, is never able to shake this allegation of being corrupt as a party, and the corrupt Congress narrative sort of takes root in this particular incidents in the 1980s. And a series of sort of scandals, corruption scandals, keep coming to the forefront throughout the 90s and throughout the 2000s. Which the BJP then finally capitalizes on, and it feeds into a very large scale social movement against corruption, which was on surface independent from the BJP, from the far right party, but later evidence comes that sort of they had a role to play in this large scale social movement as well. And so this is sort of as Marina mentioned, there's historical contingencies in each of the cases, and this is happening during the same time period that Hindu nationalism is sort of gaining cultural salience in Indian politics, right? And this is the part that the literature focuses a lot on. We know a lot about the things that the BJP and the larger Hindu nationalism movement did in the 90s and 2000s to sort of consolidate ground and come to that 2014 moment of gaining a full majority in the parliament. But the anti-corruption part is sort of overlooked in the literature on India, and that was sort of one of my goals to sort of recover this history of anti-corruptionism that's really happening in the background, and you wouldn't fully realize that it's happening until you start tracing these scams and scandals and how it's being orchestrated in and being brought in sort of public memory and public conversation. And the other part of it is sort of that Hindu nationalism in itself is sort of seen as an illiberal project because India is a secular democracy, right? So sort of establishing a religiously nationalistic state is sort of seen at odds with like India's original project of sort of having a secular democracy. And a lot of this anti-corruptionism spectacle is sort of garnered towards a certain kind of middle-class Indian who sort of still believes that, at least at the surface level, still believes that this could be a potentially illiberal project, but something needs to be done about corruption, right? So it sanitizes the Hindu nationalism project in terms of, of like, okay, we don't agree with violence against Muslims, we don't agree with violence against Dalits, but something needs to be done about corruption in Congress, right? Something needs to be done about bribe seeking, rent seeking, and things like that. And this is sort of a party that is telling us that it will do something about this. So it sanitizes a kind of illiberal project. I'm an ethnographer, so I talk a lot to middle class people as part of my research, and I see that there's a moral rhetoric that's attached to anti-corruption, and that's what's sort of like happening. The anti-corruption spectacle is really organized for this certain kind of middle class that is uncomfortable with Hindu nationalism, but still would like to justify voting for BJP. In terms of your second sort of question about is this really a departure in India's democracy? So the election in 2014, where the BJP comes to power, is fairly part of the course. It's sort of shows some kind of strong anti-incumbency against the Congress government. It had been in power for 2 back-to-back years sessions at that point, and it's largely like it was a very dramatic election campaign. It was sort of like, I think the most expensive election campaign up till that point in India's democracy. But them coming to power was sort of fairly routine. But everything that happened since 2014 has been sort of like, at least in my reading, a clear departure from the sort of liberal secular ethos that we were aspiring towards since 1947. We didn't fully ever achieve it. But definitely, the two things that I focus on in the paper a lot is capturing of the Enforcement Directorate and the Central Bureau of Investigation. These are domestic bodies that investigate financial crimes and domestic crimes. And these have been completely captured by the ruling party and are primarily being used in today's sort of time to threaten opposition politicians with cases of corruption and threaten businesses with cases of corruption in order to sort of either make them switch parties or make businesses donate large sums of money to the BJP. Without going too much into detail, these bodies have been there forever and they have never been used to this extent. So that's sort of one of the clear departures. The thing that sort of come to light, which had always been there in the past 10 years, but has become exponentially troubling in terms of democratic process, is the complete control of the Electoral Commission of India. So we have seen this in like a couple of uh, state level elections in the past year or 2 years, is sort of massive expunging of the voter roll and sort of removing poor Muslims and Dalits from strategically removing poor Muslims and Dalits from the voter roll in constituencies where the BJP thought that they might not do well. And this is sort of, this sort of feeds into people's distrust of the democratic process in general. And there's sort of many jokes about that, it's his greatness, it's more these greatness that he's still conducting elections, at least. Like he's not declaring that, we won West Bengal or we won this particular state or that particular state. But these elections, the way they're being managed and the way the Electoral Commission of India has been completely influenced by the party is really unprecedented and very troubling in terms of thinking about the democratic trajectory of the country. And lastly, like there is such a shrinking space for social movements. It's not that social movements have not happened in the past decade. There was a large scale anti-Citizenship Amendment Act protest. There was a large scale protest against the new farm laws. The farm laws protest was actually successful in some sense. But there are repercussions for these social movement leaders. A lot of the leaders from the Anti-Citizenship Amendment Act are still in jail, and the movement kind of abruptly ended because of COVID in 2020, and a lot of the student leaders were arrested. So there is really like real shrinking of the civil space for social movements, which is also very unprecedented. You mentioned the brief emergency period of the mid 1970s, and this is sort of like living in an emergency without a declared emergency, right? It's like people can't protest, people can't ask questions to the government, and we're seeing slight tints of a lashback through our, a large-scale Gen Z protest that has been happening in India in the past month, where unemployed youth have sort of banded together to protest against large-scale scams in public examinations for medical colleges, engineering colleges, and things like that. So we'll see where that ends up and what happens with that. But it is really, I think, at least their past two terms have been a real departure in terms of how we experienced and lived and thought about Indian democracy, for sure.
Very much an ongoing then case, right? And developing with new events. Very interesting. Thank you so much, Hera. I would like then to build on some of the aspects that you were discussing, but bring the conversation back to Brazil, to Luciano, because so what Hera was discussing in terms of the role of religion and the use of anti-corruption to kind of facilitate the move of the agenda in that direction, or the consolidation of power in that direction. It brings to mind the mobilization of evangelical groups across Latin America. As we know, evangelical groups have become more politically active and consequential in multiple countries over the last 10, 15 years. And of course, in terms of the rise to power of Bolsonaro, also it is well known that they played an important role. Yes. Um, so I would like to know about if you see them also having played a role in terms of how Bolsonaro approached issues related to public integrity during his administration, and potentially also from a broader perspective about the influence of religion in this intersection between anti-corruption and illiberal politics in the country.
So thanks for the question, Joseph. It's a great one, and I'm afraid, even though this is a great question, actually, there's very little literature about this in Brazil, particularly, including the relationship between, let me be very specific, neo-Pentecostal evangelicals and anti-corruption in Brazil, right? So that's why Manoel and I do not touch much on this topic, very little actually, in our article. But again, if there is anyone in the audience who wants to conduct research on a relevant topic, right? If they're graduate students, PhD students, whatever, right? Or just people who want to pursue any kind of relevant research involving Brazil right now. This is a topic. I remember the various meetings of the workshop. I remember discussing this with Marco and with Marina and with Hera, with Manoel. This is a topic that deserves greater attention, especially because this is a demographic that is changing. And as you said, Joseph, precisely, it's a group that's been growing over the past few decades or so, right? So let me be very careful here because it's not exactly my topic of research. So indeed, as you said, Joseph, this is a large segment of the Brazilian population. When you speak of evangelicals in general, and a fast rising one. So it represents something like 25, 27% of the Brazilian population. It represented 15%, right, 20 years ago. But then evangelicals is something of this umbrella term, right, for various different religious beliefs and especially different political and religious organizations, right, which have various different kinds of involvements with politics and alignments or disalignments, right, with politics, political parties, and political issues, right? So when we speak strictly, about the neo-Pentecostal evangelicals, which is this group that has become more vocal in Brazilian politics, it represents something like, at best, 15% of the Brazilian population. It's a lot, right? But it's not a majority, right? But it's a pivotal, right, segment of the Brazilian politics, or the electorate, if you will, right? It became more politically mobilized, especially since the 2010s. So it aligns with the resurgence of the right, so to speak, right? And to speak more frankly, that people are from the right, which is something that was not very used in Brazil until the 2010s in many ways, right? So legislators saying, well, I'm a right-wing politician, right? Speaking frankly about it, right? And this included, these organizations and political groups included mobilization both about religious issues, like abortion, right, same-sex marriage, and so on, and non-strictly, right, religious issues, tax breaks for churches, and so on and so forth, right? And of course, depending on the different organizations, there are different types of engagement with political issues, right? So some are indeed very close to Bolsonaro and his political group and supporters, right? So you can think of, for instance, telepastor, actually, Silas Malafaia. He's very closely aligned to Bolsonaro. The same goes to some of the members of Bolsonaro's party right now, the PL, the Partido Liberal Party, which includes some neo-Pentecostal leaders, so Magno Malta, Sóstenes Cavalcante, but not everyone, not all neo-Pentecostal evangelical leaders who take a political job are inside Bolsonaro's parties, right? So there are important political parties, especially this one political party, which is actually the project or the branch, if you will, of one specific church, right? The Universal Church of the Kingdom of God, which is Edir Macedo's project, which is a broadcaster, a TV broadcaster, if you will. It has his own party, which is Republicanos, which houses, so to speak, has among its members people like a former transportation minister of Bolsonaro, which is now the state governor of São Paulo, but also individuals who are not religious, right? Such as the president of the Chamber of Deputies right now in Brazil, who is Gumoto, he's a non-neo-Pentecostal evangelical, so to speak, right? So there are also evangelicals in other parties. So there is competition. This is an important thing, right? It's not a homogeneous group, right? There's competition inside this group, right? And across parties inside this group, right? So going back with all this to your question. In many ways, as I said, Bolsonaro's presidency was far from being an anti-corruption presidency. It had an anti-corruption rhetoric, but that was it, right? Actually, quite in the opposite direction. And Bolsonaro's alignment with this group did not seem to result from the specific issue of corruption and anti-corruption, right? Actually, what Bolsonaro was able to do in many ways was to capitalize on the anti-workers' party, the anti-PT, Partido dos Trabalhadores, sentiment, which in many ways already existed within the right, in many ways, and become kind of this pole that aggregated different forces around it. So to the best of my ability, right, every time you want to see whether or not the anti-corruption issue or the corruption issue mobilizes people, you see how they reacted, for instance, to Bolsonaro's measures that were pro-corruption, so to speak, or anti-corruption measures. And every time Bolsonaro did that, the needle within the neo-Pentecostal evangelicals didn't move much. It moved mostly, right, independent voters, right? People who voted for Bolsonaro because they were against the left, not because they were pro-Bolsonaro or even within the right. So in many ways, anti-corruption seemed like this topic that helped consolidate Bolsonaro as the antithesis of the PT, the corrupt, that's why, right, party in many ways, as it became to be labeled by the right in Brazilian politics, right? And within this group, there is, of course, the group of neo-Pentecostal evangelicals, but not, as far as I know, and again, this is not a well-researched topic to the best of my knowledge, it doesn't seem to be highly correlated, right? The support for anti-corruption and the religious support. But again, it's a topic deserving way more attention than it has received so far.
That's really fascinating and very very interesting. So it to a degree, I guess it reminds me as well of the relationship between the Trump administration and religious groups, right? That seem to stay solid or stable regardless of scandals and allegations and etc. etc. Eh, Manuel, so in the case of El Salvador, right? Because as I've already mentioned, Trump, I guess we can go in that direction. Uh, so the White House has had an interesting relationship with both El Salvador and Brazil over the last year. Yes, very influential in very different ways. Very supportive of Bukele, very critical and combative with the Lula administration, and also having effect apparently in both countries in terms of political support for the leaders, right? Um, how do you see the influence of the United States over corruption in both countries? You can speak about the past decade or more currently if you wish.
Okay, great. So yeah, no, this is another question that would deserve like maybe 2 hours of conversation, right? So I'll try to be brief and just give some like anecdotes here and there about the two countries, and yeah, especially if we go back in history, it would be even harder to cover. So to do a good job, also similar to Luciano's answer, like this is not a super well researched topic, right? So it's also hard to get information on the true intent of like foreign policy of the US and the different relationship that it's building. So, but still, like what we observe, right? Yeah, a lot also depends on US domestic policy, right? So politics. So we are not, yeah, it's like it's also something that drives, and the fact that El Salvador has a large community in the US also matters, right? And there's a lot of variation. I would say there is a lot of variation over time in how much attention the US has played to anti-corruption in both countries, right? But the US played an influential role when El Salvador was implementing the reforms that I mentioned in the beginning, right? In terms of providing capacity to like helping with capacity building in terms of when El Salvador was strengthening its judiciary, right, in the 2000s and early 2010s. Right. But it also, so as an anecdote that we provide in the article, right, is that, for example, the Obama administration would pay for the bulletproof cars that were used by this specialized team, right? The specialized unit against impunity that Douglas Melendez, the Prosecutor General of El Salvador, constructed right after 2016. So these people were driving cars like bulletproof cars, just to tell you, like also like the level of risk that this job entailed, right? But and then we also observed something, which is the condemnation of the Biden administration when the power grab by Bukele, right, in 2021. Still, there was like some like very diplomatic tightrope, right, for the U.S. government to play. Didn't want to alienate its allies in the anti-corruption side, but also would not want to cut, like to be very forceful against Bukele and try to open, like to keep the channels pretty much open with the government for negotiations, right? So that was like an interesting aspect that certainly also deserves more research, right? So, and and then of course, Bukele and Trump, that is not very much on anti-corruption, but it's more general, right? I would say. And in terms of Brazil, right, we also observe over time, maybe less so than in El Salvador in terms of the importance, right? But also it has to do with the size of the country, but playing some support and a limited, I would say, support in terms of like helping building judicial capacity in Brazil but in the Lava Jato, in the car wash investigations, the DOJ played a very significant role, right? Because it also used the fact that Odebrecht had like used a bank account in New York to play a role in also investigating it, but also the fact that the Petrobras, the oil company, pretty much in the center of the scandal, had the stocks exchange in the U.S. and then the DOJ under the Foreign Corrupt Practice Act used that to investigate, and also that was important also not only for Brazil but even more so in relative terms for the other countries that were affected by this car wash scandal, right? So these are some important times when the U.S. got closer, right, in terms of paying attention to anti-corruption in Brazil and in El Salvador, right? And something interesting, right? The more recent things in Brazil, right, was that the Trump government sanctioned Brazilian justices, right? And then removed the sanctions, right? So it was quite quick, but it was pretty much in the months preceding when it seemed that clear that Bolsonaro was going to get convicted for plotting a coup, right? And it pretty much it was actually quite forceful in terms of like using the Magnitsky Sanctions Act, right, against Brazilian Supreme Court justices, right? And also it was used one of the justifications for imposing tariffs on Brazil. So definitely some level of like strong policies towards the Brazilian judiciary, more in terms of like its role in terms of punishing Bolsonaro for crimes against democracy than for corruption itself, right? But some like important times when it played the role.
Thank you. I'm very glad that you mentioned the sanction on Brazilian Supreme Justices, because of course it's inevitable that we'll think in terms of the political objective or political goals of the White House in that aspect. Because certainly the issue was not about concerns for the rule of law or anti-corruption. At least that's not how it seemed for most external observers. Now, if I may then invite back Hera, because the case in India, right? And I would like to ask you something very similar, but in the case of India, it's a little more complicated, right? Because now we're seeing what can be properly labeled state capture, right? In with the Modi administration, but of course, India it doesn't just have influence from the United States, but also China plays a very significant role in the construction of political discourse and foreign policy, and potentially the European Union. I don't know. I would like to ask you how you see the relationship or the influence of these significant global players in terms of stabilizing or potentially threatening the power hold that Modi has at the moment?
Yeah, I'm also again like going to hedge my responses because this is not my area of expertise. Uh, but I think sort of one thing that's been interesting, and I forgot to mention this in my previous comments, is that there is sort of like a complete decimation of also the free press in India in the past decade. So the only time that the Prime Minister has given a press conference has been on foreign soil, and it's happened only two times in the past 12 years. So one was in 2023 in the White House, and one was very, very recently in Norway. And both the times, some feisty female journalists asked him about his record for about human rights and about his about the illiberalism that's sort of festering in India at the moment, and both of them were dragged through the mud on social media, as you would imagine, by these far right actors and things like that. So sort of thinking about like building accountability. I mean, I'm from India. I'm from the global south. So from the way we look at Western liberal institutes, we sort of see the hypocrisy of where building accountability is. Has been sort of laid bare, especially in the past 3 years, where sort of the Western liberal enterprises investments in maintaining human rights has been. So we don't have a lot of hope from like of like destabilizing in this regime in any way. And also that's sort of like there's also, I mean, domestically, what is happening and the conversation about foreign policy is also like fascinating. I think before 2014, there was a lot of political science work about how foreign policy doesn't affect domestic Indian politics in any way. But now we see sort of this like this sort of image of a strong man has been sort of portrayed in contrast with, this is India's time in the 21st century. We are going to be world leaders. We are going to overtake China, which is all sort of bullshit, bullshit narrative in some way. But it has a lot of purchase in like, your average middle class sort of rhetoric about what this regime and what this government is doing for Indian politics on the global stage. And there's sort of this complete demonization of any kind of foreign human rights actors as foreign influence on Indian democracy. So Human Rights Watch their presence in India has been fairly minimalized in the past decade. Amnesty International's offices were completely shut down. Oxfam's offices were completely shut down. This was all done through like strengthening of a legislation called the Foreign Contributions Regulation Act, which is actually an emergency era act from 1975, where it was completely overhauled in 2020 to make any kind of like foreign funding for human rights work and civil liberties work extremely difficult in India. And there's sort of a painting of everything as foreign influence on Indian democracy and dehumanization of these sort of actors and bodies. But this is also like a lot of foreground, a lot of background of this is that there is crony capitalism that's sort of unfettered in the past decade or so, right? So one of the figures that I talk about in the paper, Gautam Adani, who's sort of risen to this oligarchical status and had a very close friendship with Modi since the beginning of his time as a politician. He has sort of benefited greatly from this regime and sort of has gotten a ton of government contracts and things like that, and had like a large scale actually corruption case on him by a New York district court that was brought up, I think, last year. And it was sort of the Trump government, I think, expunged him from that case 2 months ago. So, as Marina was saying, that there is like, an investment in sort of protecting foreign capital in developing democracies and their investment. So that's like, this whole like foreign interference is the enemy, is the foreground of the thing, but the background of it is like, the Human Rights Watch is the enemy, but Sam Altman is not, who's building data centers left, right, and center in India, right? And is on stage with Modi in AI summit and things like that. So that's sort of like the interesting background part of this. So.
It's so interesting. Thank you for that, Hera. Marina, now in the case of Ukraine, because of course for the special issue, earlier you were talking about the structure of the special issue more in general. You, of course, also author a paper on the specific case of Ukraine. Um, so Ukraine, of course, have also had an interesting relationship to major powers in the region, specifically, of course, in its relation to the European Union. The obvious example that comes to mind is during the Maidan Revolution, right? Where very much the question is, are we Europeans, or do we belong within the sphere of influence of the Russian state? Was very much the issue, right? Now, there has been also discussion over the last year about the efforts for anti-corruption, the stability of anti-corruption efforts. But of course, Ukraine is a very peculiar case among the cases reviewed in the special issue because, of course, it is in the middle of a military invasion, right? So what can you tell us about? I guess this is a very broad question, but if you could tell us a little bit about the influence of other actors on the health of democratic institutions in the country, but more specifically, of course, in the nature of anti-corruption at the moment.
Right. No, I think that you're absolutely right that the fact that Ukraine is at war ultimately makes it a very interesting case, right? So it's interesting for a few reasons, but I think its dependence on external assistance for its survival really sheds light on makes the role of external actors critical, right? Where in other cases we see that it is important for national governments to maintain the approval of external actors as a way to sort of continue having access to resources and international recognition. In Ukraine, it's literally a matter of, are we going to live, right? Are we going to exist as a sovereign nation? So in some ways, it's kind of looking at this question under the microscope. As you sort of started indicating in your question, Ukraine's relationship with externally supported anti-corruptionism is not new. It has started probably at the turn of the millennium, and that's where sort of the Western community has recognized that in order for their support for democratization in Ukraine to take hold, fighting corruption was sort of a precondition. And over the years, this has become a really sort of important entry point for external engagement with Ukrainian politics, in part because of this extremely wide and real support from the Ukrainian population, right? So here we need to make sure that we're not just talking about external actors interfering into the country's sovereignty, taking away the agency of local actors, but rather talk about the nexus of domestic support and external influence, right? It's a topic that Ukrainians bring up all of the time, even during the war. It's corruption, sort of brought up in public opinion polls as the second most important threat to the country, right, after the military aggression. So it's this fantastic confluence of external interest in supporting anti-corruption efforts and domestic support here. Because of sort of this historical contingency of this issue emerging by the time that Russia invaded, as sort of a fundamentally domestically and externally supported issue, and Ukraine's new dependence on the West for its survival. External actors, though, have kind of received a lot of leeway and a lot of freedoms in suggesting anti-corruption reforms that also, I would say, promote their own political interests in the country. So I don't talk about this much in the specific paper, but generally, a lot of the anti-corruption recommendations during the war have been sort of have gone beyond the usual pale. For instance, the transparency requirements that the international community has put on Ukraine are outstanding, right? So there are very few countries in the Western world where public servants and politically exposed people have to tell the state and the public as much about where their money comes from and where it goes as it is in Ukraine, right? Of course, the justification is we need to know that the aid goes where it's supposed to go, and it's a completely understandable requirement. At the same time, it really opens up the inner workings of the Ukrainian state for constant monitoring by the external actors in an unprecedented way. The second set of requirements is the installation of independent monitors, but of course they come from the West, on the state board. The boards of state enterprises in Ukraine, right? Like, so the major oil giant, Ukrenergo, the Zaloznaya, which is the railroad kind of company, are all now sort of co-governed by Western actors and local actors. And again, justifications make sense for why this is necessary. At the same time, we're kind of seeing in this historical contingency that unusual, involvement, right? The sharing of governance, governance decision making that is typically reserved to sovereign actors. The specific paper that I wrote for the special issue looks instead at the impact of increased importance of anti-corruptionism at this moment on public discourse, right? So one of the things that happened is that over the years prior to the invasion, the international community has invested a lot into the anti-corruption civil society actors. So these are domestic actors. These are folks who are Ukrainian, usually young, West-educated, energetic. And the international community has given them a lot of money and support to kind of develop their activity. And now, under the conditions of war, these actors have become sort of kind of liaisons between the domestic civil society and Zelensky's government on the one hand, and Western actors on the other. And a lot of the time, they're so powerful that they engage with the government on this extremely adversarial order. So the power is distributed. They're no longer watchdog organizations or civil society challengers of the government. They're kind of almost equally powerful actors because their access to anti-corruption resources in this moment. And the paper shows the different ways whereby the arguments and the contestation between them and the government leads to pernicious polarization. Or discourse has gotten really polarized in Ukraine in the sense that the usual points of contestation are flattened. There's a lot of back and forth accusations that, if you're not for us, you're kind of against us and you're an enemy, and there is no more democratic deliberation. It's kind of shutting each other out if the other side does not do exactly what the other side considers appropriate. So the argument here is that it's not just structural that anti-corruption reforms can lead to the weakening of democratic institutions, but rather also within the public discourse and political culture, extensive and sometimes maybe overly significant weight of anti-corruption reforms as it happens under the conditions of war can lead to something that to essentially the weakening and the dissolution of democratic deliberation. That's pretty dangerous for countries' political health.
That's such an interesting and an important point because indeed this is another ongoing case, right? And it invites us to think about the potential or risk for future backlash. And so it's like seeing the case evolve in real time, and by learning on cases in other parts of the world is, well, now we can think about if one path or the other are going to take place. So interesting. So thank you for that, and of course to the rest of the panelists. We don't have a lot of time, but I would like to open the floor for a few minutes for any questions that the attendees may want to ask, or perhaps comments or suggestions. The microphone is open if anybody would like to say something about this. Alexei, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much for organizing this seminar and for discussing this topic. I'm as a person who was directly involved in the anti-corruption reforms in a very liberal context for more than 20 years. I have just one comment on what Marina said during her first intervention and maybe some observations. I will try to be very brief. First, a comment on what Marina said. She mentioned that in Russia, anti-corruption legislation was applied to political opponents. Frankly speaking, I don't think that was the case. Mainly other laws, such as those regarding foreign agents, were typically used for that purpose. There were a few instances of such misuse of anti-corruption legislation, but not so many. And strangely enough, anti-corruption measures were mainly used to target not the open opposition, but rather members of the political and bureaucratic elite who had fallen out of favor for one reason or another. So it's more a kind of a tool of inter-elite struggle than a tool of suppressing opposition in Russia. Why it was so, I tried to discuss a little bit in a recent chapter in the book Anti-Corruption in a Discordant World that was published recently. And some observations. The first one is, well, I believe that the misuse of anti-corruption measures, meaning the use of anti-corruption laws and infrastructure for purposes other than combating corruption, extends far beyond the liberal regimes. I'm afraid that we're dealing with a much more widespread problem here. I'm afraid again that genuine anti-corruption efforts are politically unprofitable in the long run. And that is why even in liberal democracies, politicians' true motivations for promoting the anti-corruption may not be entirely driven by a desire to combat corruption. And it seems to me that the issue of the motivations behind the recent national anti-corruption efforts it's a huge topic and maybe one of the most important to discuss. And second, I would say that even in the liberal context, the anti-corruption is a bit more complex. It's not, black and white. It's not about misuse or proper use. It's the mixture of different motivations, different influences, and different forces behind these efforts. For example, anti-corruption is not determined solely by leaders or even top-level officials. In reality, the nature of anti-corruption efforts is often shaped by officials and experts at significantly lower levels. And those people who actually draft the laws with their own hands, they may have motivations quite different from the motivations of the leaders. For example, these people at the lower level may have a sincere desire to combat corruption, and they may use various methods and techniques to disguise anti-corruption measures that they consider useful, but that those that the top leadership strongly disapproves of or doesn't want to implement or something like this. So it's a more complicated thing. It's not only about political leadership, authoritarian leadership. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a very nuanced comment. And I'm very glad also that you brought up the latest volume by principal advisor of U4, David Jackson, anti-corruption in a discordant world. Really valuable contribution as well. I was glad to see your chapter in it. Marina, or perhaps any other of the panelists today, would you like to?
I just want to quickly thank Alexei for his correction, and he's absolutely right. The anti-corruption legislation and accusations of corruption against the local local governmental elites, right? So, for instance, the wave of firings of governors in Russian regions, and corruption charges and whatnot, is absolutely a way of managing intra-elite conflict. I completely agree. I guess I meant to say that it is still concentrated in the hands of the federal governmental leaders as a way to manage discontent slash pursue their own political agendas through this mechanism.
Thank you. Is there any other comment or questions? All right. Then I guess we can start wrapping it up here. We went a slightly beyond, I guess, that 90-minute point. I don't want to abuse too much the kindness of the fantastic panelists that we had today. Marina, Manuel, Luciano, and of course Hera. This is a topic which I believe is, as Alexei also kind of hinted at, it is extremely important and timely for both liberal democracies and countries undergoing illiberal processes and potentially even democratic and non-democratic jurisdictions as well. Certainly a topic that has not received sustained attention by mainstream anti-corruption scholars. So a lot of very important and significant questions to be asked. So I hope we can keep the conversation going. And again, Marina and colleagues, thank you so much. I really appreciate you having taken the time to explain these complex topics and cases to us. And for those of you who will be watching this video later on YouTube, please, if you would like to also participate in this conversation, do not be shy and feel free to reach out to either Marina, Manuel, Luciano, or Hera, or myself as well. I will be more than happy to redirect your comments or questions. Thank you again, everyone, and I hope to see you all in the next iteration of this webinar series. Have a good day and evening.
Thanks a lot, Joseph.